Welcome to the first episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I'm a professor of English at Stanford University. Today I want us to explore the concept of tragedy and to relate it to issues of grief and grieving. And to do this, we are going to be pursuing the discussion in two parts. The first part will be on Aristotle, specifically Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And the second part will be literary examples from Shakespeare, specifically the character of Ophelia in Hamlet, and secondly, the character of Job in the Bible. Now, let's get on with it. Many people use the term tragedy to refer to bad, nasty, or terrible things, or indeed catastrophes. And this is the common usage in the newspapers, in social media, generally. However, the concept of tragedy has a slightly more complicated history in the many expressions of the form of tragedy from the Greeks to current times. And so, in brief, what tragedy means, among other things, is that it is not the catastrophes by themselves that indicate tragedy, but the threat to our sense of integration. And so, a tragedy is the product of the things that make us feel that we are disintegrating. Of course, people will obviously have different interpretations within the tragic tradition of what tragedy means, but this is what I want us to thread through our discussion today. Now, for this, I want us to turn to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle offers us a moral philosophy. Now, moral philosophy is not simply about what is good and what is bad, but it is really about how to live. And so in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is concerned with the good life. And he comes up with a word or a term that was actually commonplace in the ancient Greece. And the term is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia has been translated severally as living well, as happiness, as the good life, but also as flourishing. And you will see how each of these has a bearing on what is tragedy, or what we can describe as tragedy. Now, the concept of eudaimonia for Aristotle had two central dimensions. The first dimension was that a person could not live well without being virtuous. So living well and being virtuous were connected in Aristotle's view. But to be virtuous is not simply about feeling good about yourself, but actually virtue is entailed in action or actions. And so Aristotle says somewhere in the Nicomachean Ethics that a person who is always asleep cannot be said to be virtuous. Now, there was quite a substantial disagreement between Aristotle and the Stoics, led of course by Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher. And the Stoics held that eudaimonia could not be lost. That is to say, that a person who was eudaimon, because eudaimonia was an inherent condition or inherent orientation, a eudaimon person could never lose eudaimonia. This implied that eudaimonia was not dependent on external factors. If you are eudaimon, you would always be eudaimon, no matter what happened to you. Aristotle disagreed with the Stoic and indeed with Plato, and argued that there were impediments to flourishing. Since eudaimonia, one of the dimensions, one of the translations is flourishing, Aristotle argued that there was actually an impediment to flourishing. So this is the first dimension, that virtue is an aspect of living well, but virtue is entailed in action. But virtue or living well can be impeded. But this was connected to a second dynamic aspect of Aristotle's argument. And that is that to live well, one required external goods or worldly goods. Some people have also defined it as worldly goods. But for Aristotle, worldly goods doesn't simply mean having a nice house or going to a great school or having a beautiful car. Those, of course, these material accoutrements are also important for living well. But for Aristotle, living well entailed access to things like philia, philia being the guarantees of the support of family and friends, access to citizenship. And of course, for the Greeks, citizenship was membership of a particular city state. It also entailed access to material support. It didn't do well if you were poor and you lacked material support. The part of Aristotle's discussion of worldly goods that I'm interested in mostly is the aspect of access to philia. And we'll see in a moment how important this access to philia is to our sense of grieving, and a sense of disintegration. Now, were we to translate Aristotle's term of worldly goods in our own modern day usage, we would add things like, to feel well, you need a good health system. To feel well, you need the guarantees of a healthy income to be able to look after yourself and your family. To live well, you need to have a sense of security, that you would not be subject to random acts of violence. And finally, that you would also be guaranteed in your democratic rights to express contrary opinions. For us in modern times, we would count all these as aspects of worldly goods that sustain our sense of eudaimonia or flourishing or living well. Now, the key thing about Aristotle's discussion is that the loss of access to worldly goods does not simply make you unhappy. That's not what Aristotle is interested in. The loss of access to worldly goods undermines your capacity to be virtuous. This is a very fascinating principle. So that we can imagine, were you to wake up and to find that your entire family and friends had all perished in some unnameable catastrophe. For Aristotle, this would not just make you feel unhappy, it would also undermine your capacity to be virtuous. And because it would undermine your capacity to be virtuous, it would also act as an impediment to eudaimonia. And so, unlike the Stoics we mentioned a moment ago, for Aristotle, happiness, flourishing, living well was not a given, but was actually dependent on certain contingencies, many of which were not necessarily under the control of the subject who was seeking to live well. Furthermore, that the loss of access to worldly goods also threatened the person's sense of self-integration. And it is this threat to the sense of self-integration on the loss or the attenuation of access to worldly goods that is a key definition of tragedy. As we shall see in part 2, it is this loss, signs of the loss of philia specifically, that we see triggering the sense of grief and grieving for Ophelia in Hamlet and Job in the Bible. One of the most interesting accounts of suffering is provided in the book of Job in the Christian tradition. Now, the Job story is also to be found in the Islamic tradition, and so it appears in the Quran. And in fact, there are a number of similarities between the biblical and the Islamic account. However, I should say right up front that I'm not here going to provide a theological account of Job. I have to leave that to people who are more knowledgeable in such matters. All I want to do is to focus on Job's suffering and his immediate reaction to it, and see whether we can align that with what we already learned about tragedy in Aristotle. Now, as we know, Job is informed through a series of messengers that his livestock has all been stolen or killed. His servants have all been killed. But finally, that a building has collapsed and killed all his children. Now, to the account of the loss of his livestock and the loss of his servants, Job does not react. It is only when he's told of the death of his children that he reacts for the first time. And this is what we see. This is in book 1, verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Now, what is fascinating to me about this particular moment is that on his response to what is the loss of his children, he grieves. And his grieving is demonstrated in the fact that he rents his mantle. He rents his mantle, and he's obviously very distraught. This is a traditional way in the Jewish culture of expressing deep grief. However, he also does not sin against the Lord and says nothing against the Lord. What interests me here is the struggle in Job at this moment between grief and piety, in which piety wins. So there's a struggle between grief and piety, in which piety wins. His wife subsequently is to charge Job. She tells him, curse God and die, she says. She's obviously frustrated at what is happening to her husband. And he reprimands her and refuses to curse God. In other words, piety is still dominant over grief. Shortly after his wife's charge, his 3 friends arrive. In fact, they arrive after he's been afflicted by the next set of tribulations, which is that his entire body is covered in boils. The boils are so bad that Job has to scratch himself with a potsherd. He is in a very bad state. And when his friends arrive, we are told they lift up their eyes far off. This is chapter 2, 12. And they lift up their eyes far off and knew him not. They lifted up their voice and wept. And they rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Now, when his friends see him, they rent their mantle altogether and they cover their heads in dust. They're enacting what is his inexpressible grief on his behalf. And then they sit in silence with him for 7 days and 7 nights, as though to share the inexpressibility of the grief. And it is after this, after his friends bear witness to his inexpressible grief, it is only after this that Job allows himself to speak his grief against his piety. And this is what he says. This is the third chapter. After this, opened Job his mouth and cursed his day. And Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. At this point, Job finally surrenders to his grief, and his grief conquers his piety. The central point I want to take out of this is, as I said earlier, not the theological interpretation of Job's grief, but rather the fact that grief, as expressed in here, is a complex of different emotions. So we can see that, in fact, it is not simply that his grief vies with his piety for expression, but in fact that his piety is part of his grief. And we shall see in the subsequent discussions of tragic texts, as in future episodes, how complex the idea of grief really is and its expression. So this is what I take from the book of Job. The next literary example I want to use to illustrate the complexity of the idea of grief and grieving is from Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. And I'm going to focus specifically on Ophelia. And this is a description of her condition in Act 5, Scene 5. So this is the opening of Act 5, Scene 5 of Hamlet. Enter Queen, Horatio, and a gentleman. Queen, I will not speak with her. Gentleman, she is importunate, indeed distract. Her mood will needs be pitied. Queen, what would she have? Gentleman, she speaks much of her father, says she hears there is tricks in the world, and hems and beats her heart, spurns enviously at straws, speaks things in doubt that carry but half sense. Her speech is nothing, yet the unshaped use of it doth move the hearers to collection. They aim at it and botch the words up fit to their own thoughts, which, as her winks and nods and gestures yield them, indeed would make one think there might be thought, though nothing sure, yet much unhappily. Horatio, it were good she was spoken to, for she may strew dangerous conjectures in ill-breeding minds. Now, this is the start of Ophelia's madness. And it's before she actually appears on stage distributing flowers. There are several things of interest in this description early description of Ophelia's madness. One is that she expresses herself in different gestures. She beats her chest, for example. But also her words, she botches her words. So she speaks. People are not clear what she's saying, but they assume that what she's saying bears meaning. And so we are told that her speech is nothing, yet the unshaped use of it doth move the hearers to collection. Collection means interpretation. So even though her speech is uncertain, it moves the hearers to interpretation. And the fact that she is Polonius's daughter, and Polonius was the Lord Chamberer, or we might describe it in modern day parlance as the chief of staff in Claudius's palace. The fact that she was the chief of staff's daughter means that her botched speech and vague things that she says might carry some meaning beyond themselves. Now, we are familiar with many representations of Ophelia, especially her suicide after this scene. We are familiar of her entry onto the stage, a very painful distribution of different flowers. But what we find then is that Ophelia lets us get into an aspect of grief and indeed of suffering, which is quite different from Hamlet's grief. Because we have to understand that Hamlet is grieving at the start of the play. He has returned from university at Wittenberg. In fact, he's been recalled from Wittenberg. And he has been recalled 3 months after his father, King Hamlet, has died. He is extremely upset that his mother, Gertrude, has married his father's brother, Claudius, because Hamlet thinks that his uncle is not worthy of his mother. But the other thing that complicates the situation for Hamlet is that he is falling in love with Ophelia that we've just encountered. But Ophelia has been spurning his advances. And we later, of course, discover that she's been spurning her advances on the advice of her father, Polonius. But all these things, his return back home from university, his mother's hasty marriage, and so on, institute a sense of internal emotional turmoil for Hamlet before he meets his father's ghost. So there's already a state of turmoil before he meets his father's ghost, and the father's ghost tells him that he was indeed assassinated by Claudius, and the ghost, King Hamlet, charges the young Hamlet to avenge his death. But to compound Hamlet's problems, he should avenge his death but not harm his mother Gertrude. Now, this visitation by the spirit of old King Hamlet compounds what, as I've already noted, is the already existing emotional turmoil in Hamlet's consciousness. However, unlike Ophelia, Hamlet shapes his identity through the fine use of language. He's a very, very superb rhetorician. And in fact, his rhetorical facility was a central part of his self-making or shaping as a courtier. But the habits, the practiced habits of beautiful rhetoric were also the way by which Hamlet attempts to interpret the world. And his interpretation is both cognitive and emotional, as we see, for example, in his reaction to the visiting players when the player king delivers the magnificent speech about Hecuba. And this affects Hamlet quite strongly. The point that I want for us to note, though, is the contrast between Hamlet's grieving, obviously. He's grieving, but his ability to retain the facility of language and rhetoric, and the contrast with Ophelia's grieving, where, as we just saw, her language is the first thing that collapses. And so, Ophelia's lack of capacity to speak clearly is central to the way she grieves the passing of her father, who, by the way, has been inadvertently murdered by Hamlet. And so Ophelia experiences the loss of philia. We must go back to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, both in terms of the loss of her father, so family, and the loss of her boyfriend, that's Hamlet. But to compound it, it is her boyfriend, that is Hamlet, who kills her father. And so she is split every which way because her access to philia is utterly shattered. The central thing to take away from this discussion of Ophelia, however, is how her grieving is expressed in inchoate and ill-formed language, whereas Hamlet's language and linguistic facility remains more or less intact, even when he's contemplating suicide in the to be or not to be speech. He contemplates it in language that is beautifully crafted and beautifully formed. Grief, as we have seen, is first a composite of different emotions. Second, it is also issues in different kinds of expression. Sometimes in the collapse of language, as we see in Ophelia. Sometimes in the retention of rhetorical facility, but incorporating all the signs of grief. More importantly, as we draw to a conclusion, is that grief has different cultural expressions. So different cultures express grief differently, but we all express grief because it is the way by which we try to cope with a sense of disintegration brought on by the loss of those whom we love. Thank you very much, and see you next week. And remember to subscribe and share.